Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters, your Magic the Gathering source that helps you command your budget. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all their support. Hey everyone, Mitch coming in from the Commander's Quarters studio. Welcome to the show. So today's episode comes to you courtesy of my amazing patrons. Once a month, patrons vote on what commander that they'd like to see in an upcoming episode. The commander that gets the most votes wins. And the commander that got the most votes this month was Codie, Vociferous Codex. Codie is a 1/4 legendary artifact creature construct that costs 3. It has you can't cast permanent spells, and pay for tap add Wooburg. When you cast your next spell this turn, exile cards from the top of your library until you exile an instant or sorcery card with lesser mana value. Put each other card exiled this way on the bottom of your library in a random order. So Codie is a very unique commander to say the least. In fact, when Codie was first spoiled, I made a quick take on it, and I called it the weirdest 5-color commander. And that's not just because it's a talking, walking book, but because of what it does. Codie doesn't allow you to cast permanent spells at all. So once you get it in play, you completely shut yourself out from casting anything outside of instants and sorceries. Now, as I mentioned in that quick take, you can turn that major downside into a huge advantage. If you want to build a Zedru type donate deck, you can just give Codie to an unlucky opponent. If that player is playing a heavily permanent based strategy, they're probably going to get shut out from a lot of things. Now, as fun as that is, I'm going to be taking Codie in a different direction today. One of my buddies, Alec, who you might have seen on Close Quarters, or another one of my episodes, had a fantastic idea for a Codie deck. It's going to be a deck built completely around one card that Codie can help you cast consistently. Again, Codie basically lets you cascade into a spell that has a lesser value and cast it. So if we can guarantee that that spell has the lowest mana value in our deck and nothing else has that mana value, then we can ensure that we're going to hit it every single time. Or at least I should say every single time that we cast a spell that has a converted mana cost of 1 more than it. Now, what exactly is this spell and what does this deck want to do? Well, to find out, let's jump into it. Now, typically I don't bring up the Golden Pig of a deck as the first card that I talk about, but in this case, I think it makes the most sense. The Golden Pig of the deck is going to be the number 1 card out of our 99, and the Golden Pig of this deck is Living End. Living End is a sorcery that has no mana cost, so you can't cast it. Well, I should say normally you can't cast it. In this deck, you can. In normal scenarios, you'd suspend 3 for 2 black in order to cast it later. But Codie is anything but normal. Anyways, its Oracle text reads, each player exiles all creature cards from their graveyard, then sacrifices all creatures they control, then puts all cards they exiled this way onto the battlefield. So this is a mass removal spell that also mass reanimates all creatures. Again, because it has no mana cost, its mana value is technically 0. So as long as this is the only spell in our deck that has a mana value of 0, which it is going to be, we're always going to hit it if we cast something that costs 1. When we're set up and ready, we activate Codie, we use one of the mana that Codie generates to cast an instant or sorcery with a mana value of 1, and then we have some fun. Everyone exiles the creatures in their graveyard, and then everyone's gonna sacrifice every single creature that they have on the board. Sorry, Codie, you did your job really well, but goodbye for now. Then everyone gets those exiled creatures that were previously in their graveyard into play. And with the way that this deck is built, I can guarantee that we're going to have the most. Now you might be thinking, well Mitch, Codie says we can't cast permanents, so how are we going to make use out of all these creatures in our deck? I mean, they're just going to be dead cards. Well, you see, there are certain creatures out there that we can get into our graveyard with absolutely no problem. And they're even kind enough to replace themselves when they do so. So what kind of creatures am I talking about? Well, let's move on to the next cards to find out. I, of course, am talking about cycling creatures like Drannith Healer, Drannith Stinger, and Flourishing Fox. Drannith Healer says, whenever you cycle another card, you gain 1 life, and it's got cycling for 1. So with this in our hand, we basically just pay 1 mana to discard it and draw another card. And then Draenus Stinger and Flourishing Fox both have Cycling 1 as well, but they do slightly different things when they're in play. Draenus Stinger deals 1 damage to each opponent whenever we cycle another card, and Flourishing Fox gets a +1/+1 counter on it when we cycle another card. Essentially, for all intents and purposes, these kind of cycling creatures are just cantrips. They go into our graveyard, which is exactly where we want them, and they also help us dig further into our deck for more creatures with cycling. When we're ready, we activate Codie, cast that instant or sorcery spell that costs 1, and then we have some fun with Living End. We get rid of all the creatures on the board, and then all these cycled creatures are coming into play. So we're going to have a massive army to demolish our opponents, and then from then on, if we cycle some cards, we get extra benefits with these types of cards in play. And speaking of extra benefits, let's talk about some other cycling creatures like Curator of Mysteries. It has cycling for a blue, and it says whenever you cycle or discard another card, scry 1. So with this in play, it can really help us with card selection whenever we cycle a card. And then Horror of the Broken Land says whenever you cycle or discard another card, it gets +2/+1 until end of turn. So with this in play and cycling a ton of cards, it can hit really hard. And then Windcaller Aven says when you cycle it, target creature gains flying until end of turn. So if after we clear the board and we've got our giant army and our opponents happen to get some blockers out, well, this throws another wrench in their plans if they don't have any flyers. Now with these and other cycling creatures, we really want to focus on ones that have a very low cycling cost. Again, the lower that cost is, the easier it is for us to cycle a ton of these in a turn. So we can get more into our graveyard more quickly to set ourselves up for that big turn. So some other cheap cycling creatures we're going to be running are Architects of Will, Striped Riverwinder, and Street Wraith. With a lot of the cycling creatures in this deck, it really doesn't matter too much if they do, well, anything. If they do something, it's just kind of an added benefit. We really want to focus on getting more and more of these into our graveyard, so yeah, the more creatures and the more power, the better. That being said, a cycling creature like Architects of Will can be great for multiple reasons. First off, it's pretty easy to cycle since it's got cycling for Dimir. And secondly, when it comes into play, we look at the top 3 cards of target player's library, then put them back in any order. So we just get a nice ETB for absolutely nothing. And then Striped Riverwinder is a simple creature, a 5/5 with hexproof. Now paying 7 mana for that is not all that great, but again with this kind of a deck, we basically just got it for free. Okay, technically we paid 1 mana to cycle it, but we also drew a card. And of course, Street Wraith is a fantastic cycle card that we don't even have to pay mana to cycle. It has cycling, pay 2 life, and again 2 life in Commander is absolutely nothing. So yeah, this 3/4 with Swamp Walk is essentially 100% free for us to get into play. Now, obviously, some exceptions are made for cycling creatures with higher mana cost for cycling. Archfiend of Ifnir is a fantastic and brutal cycling card. It has cycling for 2, and when you cycle or discard another card, put a -1/-1 counter on each creature your opponents control. So even if our opponents attempt to recover from Living End and losing all their creatures, if they get more into play, those creatures are going to be gone as well. And then Valiant Rescuer also has cycling for 2, and it says whenever you cycle another card for the first time each turn, create a 1/1 white human soldier creature token. So this can help build our army even further just for cycling. And of course, Titanolthrax is a fantastic one as well. It's an 11/11 with trample with cycling for 1 and a green. So yeah, paying 2 mana to draw a card to get an 11/11 in play is really good. On top of that, when we do cycle it, we put a trample counter on target creature we control. So if we haven't cast Living End yet, congratulations Codie, you get a trample counter. That does essentially nothing for us, but it's still funny. And if we already did our Living End Shenanigans, we can give an impactful creature trample to get more damage through. Now again, there aren't many exceptions that we're making for creatures that have cycling for more than 1. But 2 more exceptions that we are making are for cards like Void Beckoner and Sheffet Monitor. Void Beckoner is an 8/8 with Death Touch for cycling for 2 and a black, and when you cycle it, put a Death Touch counter on target creature you control. Yeah, cheating out an 8/8 with Death Touch seems like a really good thing. And then Sheffet Monitor is a 6/5 with cycling for 3 and a green. When you cycle it, you search your library for a basic land or desert, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. So this is cycling that draws us a card, ramps us, and gets us a 6/5 in our graveyard. So although it's incredibly costly for a cycling card in this deck, it's gonna be well worth it. But now we need to move on and talk about the other part of this deck to actually help get these creatures into play with Living End. So now let's talk about those 1 mana spells that we're going to essentially use to cascade into Living End with things like Mental Note, Thought Scour, and Preordain. Again, when we activate Codie and cast a 1 mana spell, the only thing that we can hit is Living End. So Mental Note can be a fantastic card in this deck. It's going to mill us for 2 and draw us a card. And again, getting more cards into our graveyard is a very good thing for this deck. So Thought Scour is very similar. It says target player mills 2 cards, draw a card, and yeah, we're going to be targeting ourselves. And then Preordain says scry 2, then draw a card. So this can help us with some card selection first, and then draw us a card. So again, we can utilize these cantrips before we actually even want to get Living End. We cycle and cantrip to draw into more cards to get more creatures into our graveyard, and then when we're set up, we activate Codie and cast a cantrip. Or I guess I should specify cast a 1-mana spell because we've got some 1-mana spells in this deck that aren't cantrips, but we'll go into those later. Anyways, some other cantrips I want to bring up are things like Opt, Cerulean Wisp, and Quicken. Opt is similar to Preordain, but it's an instant and says scry 1, draw a card. So again, card selection, no matter how small, is never a bad thing. Cerulean Wisp says target creature becomes blue until end of turn, untap that creature, draw a card. So with this, we can untap Codie to activate Codie again for some extra mana. And then Quicken might actually be the best of our cantrips though. It says the next sorcery you cast this turn can be cast as though it had flash, draw a card. Again, Living End is unfortunately not an instant. And because Codie unfortunately reads, until end of turn you may cast that card without paying its mana cost, you can't ignore timing restrictions. So you would need something like Quicken to be able to cast Living End on your opponent's turn. And a surprise Living End out of nowhere right before your turn is the best kind of Living End. Your opponents literally won't know what hit them, but then you'll show them that it's a bunch of creatures that you cycled in your graveyard. Bad joke, I know. Anyways, moving on. Obviously, all the 1-mana spells in this deck don't strictly have to be cantrips, so some other ones that can help are things like Careful Study, Faithless Looting, and Brainstorm. Careful Study is going to draw us 2 cards, then we discard 2 cards. So we're essentially looting for 2, which again can help us draw some cards and also get some creatures into our graveyard. And speaking of looting, of course, there's Faithless Looting, which does the exact same thing, but it's also got flashback for 2 in red. And then Brainstorm kind of is a cantrip, I guess, but not really. Anyways, it's incredibly impactful in this deck. It says draw 3, then put 2 cards from your hand on top of your library in any order. So if we have Living End in our hand or we draw into it, we can ditch it back on top of our library. So then we basically set ourselves up for Codie so that we can actually cast it from there. We also really want to make sure that we've got other ways to get it back into our library though, so we're going to be running things like Dwell on the Past, Serene Remembrance, and Stream of Thought. Dwell on the Past says target player shovels up to 4 target cards from their graveyard into their library. So if Living End is in our hand and we've got a way to discard it with something like a Faithless Looting, we can then get it back into our library. Or after we've already cast Living End, we can actually use this to get it back into our library to do it again if we need to. And then Serene Remembrance is similar. It says shuffle it and up to 3 target cards from a single graveyard into their owner's libraries. So this is basically a recursion spell that we can keep getting back. And then Stream of Thought says target player puts the top 4 cards of their library into their graveyard. You shuffle up to 4 cards from your graveyard into your library. So with this, we can mill ourselves for 4, and again, if we have Living End in our graveyard, we can shuffle it back. And keep in mind that with each of these cards, they do say up to. And that is exactly what we want out of one of these cards. So we're never going to be forced to take any of the creatures in our graveyard and actually shuffle those back in. And keep in mind that these do have some extra utility and that we can actually host some graveyard strategies with these too. If someone puts some key pieces into their graveyard, we can say, let's just shuffle those away. But speaking of utility, some cards that can really help us out in the right situation are cards like Sea Beyond, Fire Prophecy, and Dream Cache. Sea Beyond says draw 2 cards, then shuffle a card from your hand into your library. So again, if Living End is in our hand, it's going back into our library, which is where we want it. And then Fire Prophecy is going to deal 3 damage to target creature, and we can put a card from our hand on the bottom of our library. If we do, we draw a card. So first off, this can be just some decent creature removal. And if there are no other creatures on the field, I'm sorry, Codie, I'm going to have to target you with this. Luckily, Codie's got 4 toughness, so it can survive it. But again, if Living End is in our hand, we definitely need to cast this to get it out. And putting it on the bottom of our library is probably the best place it can be. So then we also have Dream Cache, which says draw 3 cards, then put 2 cards from your hand both on top of your library or both on the bottom of your library. So again, we can either ditch some cards that we don't need, or more importantly, ditch Living End. Now with this deck, we've also got some utility cycling cards as well, like Akroma's Blessing, Countervailing Winds, and Wilt. Akroma's Blessing says creatures you control gain protection from the color of your choice until end of turn. So in a pinch, this can protect Codie or our entire team if we've got them in play. And it can also help them get through if our opponents happen to get any blockers in play. And then Countervailing Wind says counter target spell unless its controller pays 1 for each card in your graveyard. Yeah, good luck paying for that. With the number of cards that we're going to be cycling and cantripping, we're going to have a ton in our graveyard. And then Wilt is a very simple spell. It says destroy target artifact or enchantment, and it's got cycling for 2. So if we need to deal with something, we can. If not, we cycle it away. And then we've got some 1-mana spells that can help us out in different ways with Burst of Speed and Dark Blast. Burst of Speed says creatures you control gain haste until end of turn. So if we've got this in our hand and we've cast Living End and we need to finish our opponents off immediately, we can. And then Dark Blast says target creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn, and it's got Dredge 3. Dredge 3 means that if you would draw a card, instead you may put exactly 3 cards from the top of your library into your graveyard. If you do, return this card from your graveyard to your hand, otherwise draw a card. Basically, this is a repeatable way for us to mill ourselves for 3 for very cheap. And at the same time, it's tiny creature removal too. If your opponent's favorite commander is Toski, they're going to be having a bad day. But now it's time for me to wrap things up and give you my final thoughts on this deck. Codie is a very unique and weird commander that can be taken in a lot of different ways. Of course, aside from Living End, you can build around a lot of other cards that you just want to cast consistently. Or if one of your friends' favorite decks is a Gruul All Creatures deck, well, you can just go with that Donate plan instead. You give them Codie, and they give you their disdain. But yeah, again, a big thank you to Alec for coming up with the idea for this fantastic build. I had a ton of fun brewing it, and I hope that you all had a lot of fun seeing it. As always, the links for the full list and some upgrades in the upgraded list are going to be in the description below. So if you want to pick this deck up, enjoy. And with that, the show is coming to a close, so it's my turn to hear from you. So in the comments below, let me know what your thoughts on this episode are, and as always, thanks again and have a good one.